Probably just right here.
Okay.
Y'all need water or coffee or?
Where Nancy tells you
In the summer, heading down.
Yes.
to.
He's delicate, you know, he's delicate.
Pitiful.
How you doing, sir?
I'm doing good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Everything going good?
Yeah, it's been good.
Hey, Brad.
Same as.
Yeah, just for you, honey.
Hey, Brad, can you?
Yep.
Woo.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
So Nancy, you gonna be brave and sit in the sun.
Am I
Little
really right?
vitamin D.
Enough about something.
Little vitamin D.
I don't know.
I'll just stick
It
to
just
that.
shows up
There
every
you
now
go.
and then.
There you go.
The wandering stranger.
Trying to do my job.
Well, I'm afraid you're gonna go get it. Good job. Sting.
I like it. Did you do another animal too? Your second go around?
So you're still gonna be that.
Yeah, it was a race for the line. Okay.
No.
Oh, that'd be cute.
No, this is.
Giggling and trying to get off.
Trying to get on a horse? Oh, merry-go-round.
Where are the children? Because it's your nose. The church
Can't pull the line. I know.
It's not pretty big or fast. Hopefully, only 3 more.
Yes, exactly.
Ask for it. Found a Millie Castle. Found a Millie
You need one more
Yes, you have.
I know. Excited about
You'll make that decision once he's over, right?
it. Sure.
Whether there's hecklers in there.
That's right, that's right. If everybody gets up and walks out midway, I'll know that I failed.
Not for me, my father was both a scientist and a Sunday school teacher.
See, there you go.
Yes, because he was a chemist.
You're right.
Where y'all are.
He never found any incongruity.
Well, and that's what we're gonna talk about.
I heard JJ got mad.
Oh, yes, he did.
I would say, do we need some Bibles?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I heard.
Pass a few out.
I heard.
It's teacher appreciation week at St. John, and so he had to go, Melanie was going to St. John and he took them with her.
Oh,
And
here
she
and there.
told them last night that he was going to take them without us.
Some people bring their own.
I'm glad he likes it.
They had it because they don't.
I've switched over to the online Bible. It's great.
I couldn't bring my phone in because I didn't want him to worry about
And I
it.
can compare translations on the fly. Well, there you go. That's it.
Is there anybody that didn't get a Bible? We've got some more in the cabin. Okay.
All right, well, we're so glad to have Dr. Wes Stubblefield. I just found out, by the way, that Jack Mann, y'all know Jack Mann with All Saints, and Wes are brother-in-law. Is that right?
Small world.
Yep.
So check that out.
So my
That's
wife
pretty
and
good.
Kimberly are sisters.
Yeah, so we're,
Well.
yeah. I guess Kimberly leads like a yoga retreat
something.
thing. So
Yeah.
we're gonna be doing yoga next month here.
Okay.
No.
I don't stretch well.
I'm gonna be out of town
No, but we're so grateful that you're here with us, because you have to fly out of town.
Yeah, I'm leaving from here, and that's why I'm dressed the way that I am, is I'm leaving from here for Baltimore for a conference, so I'm leaving from here to go to the airport. But this worked out well, because I don't have to board until 15 till 2, so I've got some time, so I'm going to do this, and then I'll just leave, make my way over there. So most of you I know, some I've met, just today, but my name is Wes. And I'll just tell you about myself, because I always feel like it's better to get to know somebody, especially if you're listening to someone, that you know a little bit about what their individual biases are, where they come from, the way they think, because we all have those stories in our background, and the way that maybe the way we grew up or what we've heard, and I think it's important. So I grew up in Vernon, Alabama, in Lamar County, which is about 2 hours, hour and a half, 2 hours south of here, just on the Mississippi line. Very small town. My dad was a dentist. He's retired now. He was placed there. He grew up in a very small town in Kentucky, and was placed there because he grew up poor. And they had a program where they were putting dentists in small towns. And at that time, there wasn't a dentist in Lamar County. So Dad went out there because he had borrowed in 1977, when I was born in 77, so I'm 49. He had borrowed $75,000 to go to college and dental school, which if you were around in 77, you know how much money that is. That's over $300,000 today. So they gave him $25,000 and to help him set up a practice in a small town that didn't have a dentist. And then he ended up staying almost until I graduated high school. Well, they stayed longer, but I finished high school in a different town, but that's a different story. I grew up in the Church of Christ tradition. Most everybody knows the Church of Christ tradition. I grew up in a very conservative Church of Christ tradition. My dad and mom both met at Freed-Hardeman College, if you know where that is, in Henderson, Tennessee. Back then it was a 2-year school, and now it's a 4-year school. And my dad finished at Murray State and then went to dental school at UAB. I was born in Birmingham in his last year. So that's my background. I went to David Lipscomb for college, so I also went to a Church of Christ school. And then over the course of my life, I have been through a lot of ups and downs and questions, and I don't know if I know any more now than I knew when I was 21. But what I have come to terms with is that I have a lot more. Because of the way my faith has developed, I have a lot more stability in my life and in the way that I think. And so I think that, what I would like to, over the next few times that we meet together, and Trey and I talked at length the other day about what he was trying to do, and I know he's already started talking to you guys a little bit, and I love the way that he's approaching this, because I grew up in a tradition where Bible knowledge was very important. We did a lot of memorization. I won the Bible Bowl when I was 13 or something in Nashville, because I got the highest score on the test, and I think it was the book of Joshua. So biblical knowledge, biblical inerrancy, literalist reading of the Bible was very important in my tradition. And those things can be problematic if you come from that tradition. You have to figure out how to reconcile what you've learned and what the Bible says with the way that your God-given reason will take you down a path, because the Bible was written, as you all know, in a very different time. And when you say that, it sounds silly to say that, but you have to remember that the Bible was written, not only was it written a long time ago, but it was also written in a time when the people didn't think the way that we think. So we can't even, it's hard for us as people living in this age to think about the way that these people, especially the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, processed information, because they didn't think about things as true and false. That's an enlightenment thing. they didn't really make that distinction. So try to take true and false out of your brain when you read the early scriptures. There are many facts in the Bible, but that's not what's important. The Bible is a theological text. There are a lot of if you can read it, there are factual parts of the Bible, but in essence, it's a story about how God redeemed his people over time. So we are God's people. We are the end product of this, and we are in this space and time where we are living out the promises of God and the promises of God that were shown through the text. So what we as modern people think about is that we're talking about faith and science. So did anyone grow up in a Susan had already said that her father was both a chemist and a Sunday school teacher, and he didn't struggle with faith and science. Did anyone grow up with that struggle in their mind, that perceived struggle that those two things were incompatible, that science and faith were incompatible? You did?
I grew up with people who struggled,
Yes.
and they projected their struggle on others,
Mm-hmm.
But I just assumed that there were some things that made sense and some things that didn't make sense, and wherever else, when it comes to that, you can't make them fit and interlock completely. You just have to move on to the next thing, or just accept some things you're not going to know
I think that's
until later.
That's a great way to put it. Until later, because science is a field, and theology too is a field that evolves as we evolve, and it has evolved as we've evolved. If you think about all the things that have happened since the time that these words were penned, you're talking about the invention of the modern world, of modern science, and there was no modern science. I think that the thing that you want to guard yourself against is you want to be in a place. Me want to be in a place, and I hope that you are in a place where, regardless of what happens with science, it doesn't push God out of your life. God created all things. God created science. God created reason, and God created mathematics, and all of these wonderful things that we have. And just because we prove something that another time and place may have been mysterious, and we explain it, it doesn't mean that God's not there. You can fall into that trap, and you can go down a path. So the ancient peoples, when they thought about the way the world worked, remember, these people lived on just the edge of death. The average life expectancy in this time, even in Jesus' time, I don't know what it was in the ancient world, 1500 BC, but even at around the time of Jesus' birth, the average life expectancy was only in the 30s. But that's not to say that people didn't live past the 30s. What it means is that if you lived past childhood, you generally did okay. You probably lived to the 50s or 60s. But most people died in childhood. We forget that, you had to have, just to keep the population stable, each family had to have something like 6 children or something, because the childhood mortality rate was like 50%. And this was in rural Palestine in the turn of the millennium. So these people, they lived on the edge, and they were always on the risk of starving. And you think about pre-modern peoples, when they didn't understand if a river flooded, or if a drought came, or if they had insects that invaded and caused massive crop devastation. They didn't know what that meant. They just assumed that they had done something to inflict the wrath of the gods. And this is not just the ancient Canaanites. We're talking about the Jewish people, but also their neighbors. We're talking about all people, all pre-modern people. So I think that we hear stories in the media. We'll hear stories about that they've solved another mystery, that they've found some other particle that explains how something works. And the danger is that when you say, and I'm not saying I'm saying what you were saying is wrong. What I'm saying is that like you said, maybe we don't know, but we won't know until later, which I think is a great way to put it, because science is an evolving field. It will always evolve, and theology is an evolving field. And science should tell us things about theology and about God, but God should also tell us things about science through the writings of these people. So that's kind of where I want us to go with our discussion over the next little bit. We're going to throw in a little bit of scripture. We're going to talk a little bit about some Darwinism. We're going to talk a little bit about the nature of scripture and scriptural analysis. Just a little bit of this and that, so we can all touch on it, and then think in our own lives where we might meet somebody and talk to somebody about our faith and about our God and about what it means to us. And we can say, you can be a scientist. And it's also a fallacy. Another thing to think is that in the scientific world, you think about scientific minds, the intelligentsia, whatever you want to call that, the ivory tower scientists, that they're all atheists. And that's not true. There are fervently believing scientists. There are also atheistic scientists. But it's don't put everything into two camps. Remember, there's people that are both on both sides. There are also people in the middle who maybe are just trying to figure things out, like maybe most of us are. I read something the other day, and I think it was really true, and I'd never really thought about it. And it said that atheism is as problematic as theism. So to say that there's no God is the same as saying there is a God. Generally, they're both unexplainable situations. So it says you're going on as much faith to say that there is no God than you are to saying that there is a God. And it does at some point come down to faith. Maybe some people don't know, and that's probably as good as you can get. But I'm not a philosopher. I've listened to things about philosophy, and most philosophers I understand can't philosophically come to a place where they can't say that there is definitely not a God. But we as believing Christians, we believe there is a God. And we believe that when we look at these texts and we look at the story of what God has done in the redemption story in the Bible, that it does make sense, that what's in the Bible, although scientifically may not be something that we can say, that doesn't make sense in a 2026 mind. Again, we have to think about it from a theological perspective, and we have to bring our faith into it, because our faith is faith is not a cop-out. Faith is not saying, well, I'm just going to believe something because it doesn't make sense to me. No, faith is saying that God is active and is in our world. God is a personal, caring God. God has set out to redeem his people, and God will make all things right. That's the general hope of us as Christians, or as me as a Christian. I'd like to say that's us. I think it's also important, still setting the stage, that we as believing Christians, that we struggle together with hard questions, because we don't want to do this alone. The traditions that a lot of us, and particularly the tradition that I grew up in, was a very individualistic tradition. It was a tradition where the churches of Christ were a frontier church. It was a church. It was a retaliation against the learned people of the settlers of America. This was the democratization of Christianity. This is when you didn't have to have a PhD in theology to preach the gospel. Everybody, all they needed, it was very much John Locke. It was all you need is your Bible and your reason. There's some good to that, but there's also a lot of danger to that, because that means that any person outside of the context of the Christian community can kind of come up with whatever they want. We we function in a tradition where we have over millennia struggled with questions of what it means for there to be evil in the world, and what it means for God to have created us, and why are we here, and what is our purpose. And we're not going to figure that out. I can guarantee you we're not going to figure it out. We'll probably figure it out one day, but we're not going to be talking to each other at that point. You're probably going to be talking to somebody else. But these things are constant struggles of humanity. They will continue to be struggles of humanity. And we, as a group of people that living in this time and place with our God-given reason, can sit down together and talk about some very hard issues. And we can come out on the other side and say, my faith is strong. Science is a good thing. Science is a progressive thing. We don't have to state that we need to go back to an earlier time. That's a struggle. Sometimes they say, we need to go back to a different time. We need to back up of all of these things, and the Bible says it, and I believe it. Those can be dangerous things. Let's start. Let's start with where anyone would start, and I think we're going to start with the beginning. I think Trey said that he'd already talked a little bit about the creation story. Is that right?
Last week we touched on it a little bit.
Yeah.
Do your thing.
Okay. So as everyone knows and everyone has heard, there are many different interpretations and ways to understand how God created the earth. When I was growing up, it was very important that these words that we read in here somehow fit into what we knew as modern people in a post-Enlightenment world. That we had to read these things as fact. So there are different theories about the way God could have done these things. So I'm just going to read, and I'm going to read from, and I would encourage you to, if you haven't, I was telling them earlier, I have switched over to using all online Bibles. They're great because, number one, you can look up I'm going to be reading for what's called the Jewish Publication Society. It's in the 2023 edition. The JPS is what a lot of scholars use to translate the Hebrew scriptures, because they are, as what a lot of people say, they're more reflective of what the actual Hebrew says, as opposed to what's interpreted in some of our translations. And I find it to be very interesting because the words are different, and it's a little bit different. I think it's fun to follow along, but the other one that I use is Bible Gateway. I don't know if anyone has the app, but it's nice to be able, and I do this during worship, is if there's a passage that we're using, and Trey and I were talking about the lectionary, there's a passage, I'll generally look it up in 2 or 3 different versions because I want to see what the different versions say. I still have my Bible and I still use it all the time. Okay, so here's Genesis. This is just the first chapter of Genesis. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So already what we've seen, so we've got a lot of loaded information. It doesn't necessarily say that in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. It says when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, almost as if there was this unformed void matter that was pre-existent. And it also was dark, and there was the deep, and all those things were associated with unformed and chaos. So God is coming to bring order to chaos in this unformed world. And this wind from God, which is in Hebrew, I understand, is called ruach, which means breath or spirit. And so you've heard the breath of God, the Spirit of God, the wind of God. These are all very similar words. So then going on to the next verse. God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, so that it may separate water from water. God made the expanse, and it separated the water that was below the expanse from the water that was above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. So there's this pre-existent something that was chaotic and formless, and there were maybe water, and then God put space between the waters. And this was the ancient theory, or the ancient way that the Canaanites, the Hebrews, understood the world to be formed. There was the underworld below thing, so there's water below, springs, rivers. So you've read the story of Noah's Ark, that the earth broke open and the waters came from the deep. So there was that's where the waters were held. The waters were held above and they were held below. So the waters are separated into this thing. So the Jewish conception, or the Hebrew conception of the earth, is that you've got the heavens, or the firmament, which are outside, and God is outside the heavens. So it's a geocentric universe, meaning the earth is at the middle of the universe. So you've got the earth, you've got the expanse above, and then you've got the underworld. So when people would go to the underworld, they go down to where the chaos and the void is. And then you go above, and then that's where the stars and the moon and everything else are doing what they do. So you've got earth, sky, stars, God. Moving on, God said, let the water below the sky be gathered into one area, so that the dry land may appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and called the gathering of waters seas. And God saw that this was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, and seed-bearing plants of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that this was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day. Remember, the Hebrew day goes from sunset to sunrise, sunset to sunset. So you think about Fiddler on the Roof, sunrise, sunset. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night, and they shall serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years. And they shall serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth. And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to dominate the day and night, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that this was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fourth day. God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth and across the expanse of the sky. God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fertile and increase, fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase in the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fifth day. God said, let the earth bring forth every kind of creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind. And it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind, and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. And God saw this was good. And God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created humankind in a divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all living things that creep on earth. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is breath of life, I give all the green plants for food. And it was so. And God saw that all that had been made, and found it very good. And there was evening and morning, the sixth day. The heaven and earth were finished in all their array. On the seventh day that God finished the work that had been undertaking, ceasing on the seventh day from doing any kind of work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, having ceased on it from all the work of creation that God had done. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. So there's a lot of ways to think about this story of what God is, of what the people of God were telling through the story, and the way that God is speaking to his people through the story, and then speaks to us today. When I was growing up, I was told that the earth was a certain number of years old. It could not have been more than a certain number of years old. You've probably heard those. They call them young earth creationists. There are people that will go to extreme lengths to try to prove that the fossil records are inaccurate, that carbon dating doesn't make sense, that humans and dinosaurs walked on the earth at the same time. Those are generally not accepted in principles of what we know from archaeology, that there are strata on the earth that are at different sizes, that are pitched in different ways. The way that the earth crumpled so that strata moved, and so you can see that when you're going down the interstate, and you can see how strata has moved up and how places have shifted over time. There are examples from the world when we look at fossil records where we see earlier beings, and then we see more changed beings over time. And so we can explain it in different ways. We could say, one of the theories that I was told when I was young was something called the gap theory of evolution. Has anyone ever heard of the gap theory? The gap theory means that the way that some people read the first verse of Genesis, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. And then it says, and then the world was formless and void. And that can also be translated to the word became. So the one theory is that God created the heaven and earth and all the dinosaurs and all the things, and then just for whatever reason decided to wipe it off and start over. So that would explain all the fossils and all the dinosaurs, because there was this gap. There's another theory that that these 6 days were not literal days, but they were epochs of time, where time marched on. God created over time in his infinite wisdom, God's infinite wisdom. Try not to use the word his, because we try to say God is God, because God is not male or female. Remember, God is God. God is outside of us. So God, in God's infinite wisdom, God created the world in a way that progressed over time and gave us these things. Then there's also theories that everything sort of started from this one moment of time, and it spread out from an evolving universe to explain why the universe is expanding, and explains the physical phenomena we see in telescopes and other things. After a long time of reading and think about these things, I'm not really too concerned about it. What I love about this is that these were a people that had been conquered and displaced again and again and again, going through the Babylonian exile, the Assyrian exile. They had just been captured, taken away and brought back, and taken away and brought back. And they needed to pass down the traditions of their ancestors to their faith community. So they had stories about the way that the world is, and it gave them some hope that God would take all this chaos and bring something good out of it. And at some point, because these people were enslaved so many times, that God would never make them work 7 days a week. Maybe they'd only work 6 days a week and then have a day off. So there's some profound theological truths as to what's going into these scriptures that may have been written down during one of the exiles, because these were oral traditions that were written down at some later point. So there's this beautiful story of God creating all these wonderful things that we see, and the fact that humankind are different than animal kind, and we all feel that, and we all see that. Now, yes, we love our animals. I've got a dog that I swear has the IQ of like a 13-month-old. I mean, when you have to spell words in your house because your dog knows that many words, you've got to, so I get it. I mean, but we as humans, we have a grasp that we are somehow different than the rest of the animal world. they've done studies where they've looked at, can animals understand that they're not themselves in a mirror? Have you heard of this? Where there are some animals that can pass the mirror test. Some higher apes can do this. I think it's dolphins, elephants maybe. There's some that have some self-awareness, but you know, we as humans, we have a rational part of our soul, and whatever we consider to be our soul, and it's something God gave us. So we as human beings, we consider ourselves different. And again, going back to what this is saying here is that there's some very profound truths, but it also has to be set into the context of what they understand. And I'm not worried about whether or not we can prove scientifically that the first chapter of Genesis happened exactly as it was said. There are people that do. And what happened in my faith journey is that over time, when these things didn't make sense to me, as I started to learn more about physics and chemistry and geology, or whatever those things might be, then my faith became shaken, because I was told that this is the way I had to think. I had to put each of these things in some sort of order, otherwise these things don't make sense. And they don't make sense. But then you go back and you take a different perspective. So the next thing I want to read is Joshua 10. We're going to start so one thing about JPS is that they don't have verses. So when you're looking at the JPS, you have to kind of figure out where you are. It's maybe about 5 or 6 verses down, I would say. Let's see. Maybe a little farther. Does anyone see? Let me see if I can find it. It says Joshua took them by surprise, marching all night from Gilgal. Do you see that? 9. Okay. Starting in verse 9. Joshua took them by surprise, marching all night from Gilgal. God threw them into a panic before Israel. Joshua, inflicting a crushing defeat on them at Gibeon, pursued them in the direction of Beth Horon ascent, and hurried them all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. While they were fleeing before Israel down the descent from Beth Horon, God hurled huge stones on them from the sky all the way to Azekah, and they perished. More perished from the hailstones that were killed by the Israelite weapons. On that occasion, when God routed the Amorites before the Israelites, Joshua addressed God, and he said in the presence of the Israelites, "Stand still, O sun at Gibeon, O moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgment on its foes, as was written in the book of Jashar. Thus the sun halted in mid-heaven, and did not press on to set for a whole day. For God fought for Israel, neither before nor since has there ever been such a day when God acted on words spoken by someone else. So reading this, you can pretty much assume that we're talking about a geocentric universe. There's no way for the sun and the moon to stop unless everything revolves around the earth. So yet another thing where science and what's told in the story don't necessarily, to me, make any sense, but make sense in a different context. That God was doing something for the promises of the Israelite people, for the covenant that he made with his people. There are many, many places in the scriptures, whether it's the Hebrew scriptures, as time goes on, the scriptures do become more historical. And I use that term because, again, we're not talking about fact and fiction. We're talking about historical facts. And we will find archaeological facts. We have found archaeological facts that have proven things that we know that the Bible does contain archaeological truths and facts. But it also doesn't shake our faith if someone says that by the time that, and I've read this, and I don't know if this is true or not, because again, I'm not a historian, but by the time that by the time they got to Jericho, Jericho had already been destroyed. So did the walls of Jericho did really fall? Does it really matter? You know, to me it doesn't. To me, that, you know, I look at this and I see these things that are compatible with a faith in a God that is working through and with us. I wanted to read something, and I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I wanted to read something that I thought was very interesting, and maybe we can just ponder on it for next time. Everyone has heard of Darwin, right? Okay, so I'm going to read to you a passage from the end of Darwin's famous book on the origin of species. And this is a little heady, but I think it's fascinating. Okay, this is literally the second to last paragraph of the on the origin of species. It says, authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator. For the production and extinction of past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. When I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited, they seem to me to become emboldened. Judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity. And of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to a far distant futurity. For the manner in which all organic beings are grouped shows that the greater number of species of each genus, and all the species of any genera, have left no descendants, but have become utterly extinct. We can so far take a prophetic glance into futurity as a foretell that it will be the common and widely spread species belonging to the larger and dominant groups, which will ultimately prevail and procreate new and dominant species. As all the living forms of life are the lineal descendants of those who lived far before the Silurian epoch, we may feel certain that the ordinary succession by generation has never once been broken, and in no cataclysm has decimated the whole world. Hence, we may look with some confidence to a secure future of equally impeccable length, inappreciable length, and as natural selection were solely by and for the good of each being, all corporal and mental endowments will tend to progress toward perfection. I thought that was really interesting because Darwin is not and did not say that there wasn't God. What Darwin is saying is he's coming to terms with what he feels makes more sense to him as he looks at these species that have evolved over time. And so, you know, here we are in this modern world, coming to terms with what we as people of faith will do for each other. So next time we'll talk a little bit more about getting into some science, into some things that we can talk about, maybe a little bit of what we have seen more in the 21st century, as opposed to what was seen in the past, but always in the context of what we as believing Christians can believe. And then when we get to the end, my hope is that each of us comes back with a stronger appreciation for what science does, which is, remember, science is a never-ending process. Science is never settled. Things make sense for a time, just like Aristotle explained some things in his physical reality, then Newton did in his physical reality, and then Einstein did in his reality. And all of those things gave us a better glimpse into what we were able to naturally experience through our senses and through our reason. But there will undoubtedly be other theories that will come by and better explain some of those things that are unexplainable. But in all of that, our faith is what's most important, and the way that we treat each other, and the way that we include each other, the way that we come together as a people, and we struggle together we find common ground, and then we walk together through this life, holding on to one another, but also reaching out to those that don't have the luxury of having this community of faith. And so when you go out in your daily lives, that's what I want to think about is what can you do, and then when you encounter someone who has a different way of thinking than you do, you can say, you know, I want you to come and be a part of what we can do together as a group, like this group, where we can struggle together and find faith together in what seems to be, to me, a world that is shaken and is very dreary right now. There's a lot of good things about when we live. We don't have to worry about, in general, being attacked by a lion or dying of some horrible infectious disease in a day or two. It happens, but it's unlikely, not like it was in the ancient world. But there's a lot of evil out there, and evil doesn't mean that there's not a God. It just means that God loves us and cares about us and wants us to figure these things out. So that's all I had for today. I'm gonna catch an airplane.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a blessed day.
Excuse me, sir.